Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is human biology, and this is chapter 13, 14, and 15 on the cardiovascular system. And in this unit, we're going to be studying the heart, blood vessels, and the blood. Okay, so let's do an overview of the cardiovascular system. So please write this down. It contains the heart, blood vessels, and the blood. That is the anatomy of it. So physiology, the function, there are three main functions of your cardiovascular system. The first one is transport. It will transport nutrients and oxygen to nourish the cells throughout the whole body. It will also transport wastes like carbon dioxide, nitrogenous wastes with nitrogen in them, away from cells to your excretory organs. And that would be your lungs for carbon dioxide and your kidneys and bladder for the nitrogenous waste. It's also going to transport hormones to maintain homeostasis, and we just studied that in the endocrine system, and we know all about the hormones, and we know that they travel through the bloodstream to their target cells or target organs. The second thing that it does is protection. So the immune system and the white blood cells are really enmeshed, like they're really involved in the cardiovascular system. So the white blood cells and antibodies circulate in the blood and defend the body against foreign microbes and toxins. Also, clotting mechanisms, thrombocytes, protect your body from blood loss. So whenever you get cut, those clotting mechanisms make a little mesh and a scab, and it protects you from bleeding to death. The third type of major function of the cardiovascular system is regulation, and that helps you maintain homeostasis. So your blood and the heart, they help stabilize body temperature. We've talked about how they can do that way back at the beginning of the year by constricting or dilating blood vessels near the skin. They help with fluid pH. They help with the water content of the cells, and they help bring the hormones to where they need to go, which regulates everything. The cardiovascular system works with other systems. So here's a nice stylized picture that I like. So please write down, it works with the digestive system, bringing nutrients to body cells. So we see we have food coming in, and luckily we don't look like a big donut. You have food coming in, and the nutrients get diffused into the blood, which gets pumped out and sent to the cells so that they have nutrients to live. The cardiovascular system also works with the respiratory system. As you can see, oxygen is going in, and it gets diffused into the blood, and it's brought to the cells so they can live and do cellular respiration and make ATP to fuel everything. They also remove carbon dioxide, so the waste gets picked up, goes through the whole system, diffuses into the lungs, and is breathed out. The cardiovascular system also works with the urinary system to remove metabolic waste, and metabolic waste is waste made by your cells and any kind of extra fluid. So it diffuses into the blood, and then it goes through the kidneys, and the kidneys will pick up the waste and then excrete it in the urine. It also works with the endocrine system to maintain homeostasis. As we know, our glands, and there's not a picture of it, but our glands will dump hormones into the bloodstream, and they go to their target cells or organs. Okay, we are going to start with chapter 14, actually. The heart. A lot of people, that's the first thing you think of when you think of the cardiovascular system. So we are going to learn about Jim. He's having a coronary emergency. We're going to need a narrator, a medic, a couple narrators, and we're going to figure out what happens to Jim. So please write down the structure of the heart, and I'm going to have you write down the notes, and also not something this complicated, but kind of like a very simplified heart diagram in your notes. So the heart is divided into 4 chambers. And when we're talking about this, you might be like, oh, they got it mixed up. But the right, we're always talking about the patient's right. So the patient's right atrium is here, and it is a thin-walled chamber that receives blood from the body. So the blood is coming in from all over the body, and the very first stop in the heart is the right atrium. Then it goes through a valve, and it goes to the right ventricle, which is a muscular, very muscular chamber that pumps blood to the lungs. So it pumps blood to the lungs through the pulmonary artery. And then after the blood goes to the lungs and drops off its carbon dioxide, it picks up its oxygen. It's going to come back through the pulmonary vein and go to the left atrium. And again, we're talking about the patient's left. And that is a thin-walled chamber that receives blood from the lungs. Then the blood is going to go through a valve and into the left ventricle. And that's a muscular chamber that pumps blood to the body. So you can see it's quite muscular because it needs to pump the blood through the aorta to the body, where it has all the oxygen and delivers that to all the body cells to keep you alive. Another thing is the septum, which is this muscular wall that separates the right and the left ventricles. And again, it divides the heart in half. So please make a simplified view where you have the thin-walled left atrium, thicker-walled left ventricle, right atrium, and then the septum. So let's talk about how the blood moves. As you can see, blood comes from the body, and it's containing carbon dioxide, it's low in oxygen. It comes in to the right atrium through a valve to the right ventricle, through a valve through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, where it drops off its CO2 and picks up oxygen, and then it comes back through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium through a valve to the left ventricle through a valve to the aorta, and then it goes all the way through the body and drops off its oxygen and picks up the body's waste. Okay, so let's do that now step by step. So oxygen-poor blood enters the right atrium of the heart through the vein, the vena cava. So please write that down. The blood enters the right ventricle through a valve. The blood is pumped out of the right ventricle through the pulmonary artery. Blood goes to the lungs and picks up oxygen and gets rid of carbon dioxide. The oxygen-rich blood returns to the heart, which is the left atrium, through the pulmonary vein. And the blood goes through a valve and enters the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, the blood is pumped out of the left ventricle to the aorta, which is the biggest artery in your body. The blood travels through the aorta to other arteries, to small arteries that we call arterioles, to even smaller blood vessels we call capillaries. And at the body cells, the blood drops off oxygen and picks up carbon dioxide. This oxygen-deficient, oxygen-poor blood travels from the capillaries to small little veins we call venules, to veins, and finally to the superior and inferior vena cava, which are the veins that dump the blood into your heart. So the blood returns to the right atrium of the heart through the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava veins. Okay, so just a quick review of that. Oxygen poor blood comes through the superior and inferior vena cavas to the right atrium, goes through a valve to the right ventricle, this muscular right ventricle, which pumps it out through the pulmonary artery to the lungs, where it drops off its CO2, picks up its oxygen, comes back through the pulmonary vein to the left atrium, goes through a valve to the left ventricle, and then it is pumped through a valve to the aorta, where it goes through the arteries, the arterioles, the capillaries, drops off all of the oxygen in the body cells, and it picks up carbon dioxide, and then it goes through the venules, the capillaries to the venules, to the veins, and finally back to the superior and inferior vena cava. Okay, see if you can keep up with this. We're going to have it come in through the superior and inferior vena cava to the right atrium, through the valve to the right ventricle, through the pulmonary valve to the arteries, the veins, coming back to the left atrium through a valve to the left ventricle, through the aorta, and to the body. Whew, that blood is moving fast. Probably maybe 60 beats a minute for you. What could possibly go wrong with your heart? Well, there's a heart attack, and the science name for a heart attack is a myocardial infarction. So in a myocardial infarction, that is the stoppage of blood flow to the heart itself. So the coronary arteries that nourish the blood cells are blocked, and we'll kind of take a look at that. So the outcome of the heart attack depends on the severity and the location. One outcome is that you just have some damaged tissue. That's because oxygen, if the blood vessels are blocked, that means the blood isn't getting there and the oxygen is not getting to the heart cells. And the heart cells are very needy cells. They need oxygen continuously, or they will die or be damaged. Also, fun fact, the damaged tissue gives off this enzyme, creatine kinase, and that is something that they're looking for to diagnose if someone had a heart attack. Another outcome is fibrillation, which is a tough word for me. Fibrillation, it's the episode of rapid and uncoordinated heart contractions. So why would that be bad? Well, if you have atrial fibrillation, the blood pools in the atrium because your atria is not coordinated and it's not just doing one pump to get all that blood into the ventricle. So it pools there and it can cause a blood clot. And we know that blood clots can block blood vessels. So if it blocks a blood vessel in your brain, you have a stroke, and that's bad. And if it blocks a blood vessel in the heart, you're more likely to have another heart attack, and that's bad. So if you have ventricular fibrillation, that is basically no heartbeat, so the blood is not, that ventricle is not coordinated, it's not just pumping all the blood out at once to the body. So the blood and the oxygen is not getting to your vital organs, and they're going to start shutting down really quickly. So ventricular fibrillation is something that needs to be dealt with right away. And this is something where you would probably start CPR and use an AED. Because death will occur within minutes, which would be number 3 outcome, death, unfortunately. So how do we know if someone has a heart attack? Well, a symptom, and there are lots of different symptoms. One of them is severe chest pain in the arm, neck, other places, sweating, nausea. An interesting thing is women tend to have less intense symptoms, and it's easier for them to overlook, which sounds not bad, but it's actually very dangerous. Okay, as promised, I said we were going to look at these coronary arteries, and these are the arteries that supply the heart itself with nutrients, with oxygen and glucose and all the good stuff. So if these are blocked, you'll have a heart attack. and which is what we'll learn more about in our next video. All right, see you then.